Usually, when we talk about making a medical diagnosis, there is this fundamental expectation of precision. It feels like engineering.
Yeah, it's very structural.
Yeah, exactly. If you fall and, say, break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an x-ray, and you see that unmistakable jagged white line across the bone.
Mm-hmm.
The doctor points at the film, you look at the film, and the reality is just indisputable. There it is, broken.
It provides a profound sense of comfort, really, that binary nature of medical medicine. We inherently crave systems where things are entirely visible.
Totally.
We want things perfectly categorized and mathematically predictable because, it makes the chaos of the human body feel manageable.
But the moment you step out of the orthopedics ward and into the world of human desire, of psychology, and, the hidden architecture of our most intimate instincts, that comforting x-ray machine is completely useless.
It absolutely is.
When you look at the landscape of human sexuality through a purely clinical lens, you are not looking at clean breaks. You are staring into murky, uncharted waters.
And for a very long time, the scientific and medical communities simply refused to wade into those waters at all.
They just ignored it.
Completely. The subject was considered too chaotic, too steeped in morality and social convention to be treated with the cold, detached rigor of true science.
Right.
It was just easier to rely on poetic fables and societal assumptions than to actually look at the mechanics of desire.
But that willful scientific blindness held until 1905. Today, we are opening the pages of a text that fundamentally rewrote the maps of human desire and exposed the hidden architecture of the mind.
It's a massive piece of work.
It really is. We are looking at Sigmund Freud's groundbreaking 1905 work, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. And, for the sake of absolute precision and historical accuracy, we are relying on the definitive James Strachey translation.
Which is essential.
Yeah. This isn't just a book. This is the intellectual earthquake that shattered the Victorian understanding of human nature.
Freud achieved something completely unprecedented here. He stops treating sexuality as a simple biological, given like a switch that just flips on at a certain age.
Right.
And he starts dissecting it as a highly complex, fragile, and often wildly paradoxical psychological construct. He approaches the most taboo subjects imaginable with the sterile precision of a surgeon.
Welcome to Fact Horizon. This is where history meets mystery and facts define the future. We explore the profound truths of human existence, the wonders of the mind, and the secrets of the cosmos, all in one place. If you seek knowledge and wonder, you're in the right spot. Subscribe now and join our journey beyond the horizon.
To do this text justice, we really are going to have to proceed with extreme methodical care.
Yeah, we have to pace ourselves.
Definitely. The density of Freud's thought requires us to slow down and truly examine the foundation he is building.
Which is why I need to tell you, the listener, right up front. This is part 1 of our deep dive analysis.
Just part 1.
Exactly. The sheer volume of paradigm-shifting concepts here means we have to dedicate this entire first part exclusively to the foundational first chapter of Freud's work.
And that chapter is titled Chapter 1, The Sexual Aberrations.
Yes. And in this deep dive, we are going to comprehensively cover deviations in respect to the sexual object, deviations in respect to the sexual aim, and finally, a concept that changed modern therapy forever, which is the sexual instinct in neurotics.
Because this specific chapter lays the absolute bedrock for everything that follows in the field of psychoanalysis.
It's the groundwork.
Right. Without understanding the mechanics laid out here, the rest of Freudian theory is impossible to grasp.
So, our mission for this deep dive is to decode Freud's incredibly strict theoretical concepts. We're translating his highly academic, turn-of-the-century language into something accessible.
But without losing an ounce of the intellectual rigor.
Exactly. We are stripping away our modern biases, putting ourselves squarely in that 1905 clinical mindset, and looking strictly at how Freud deconstructed human sexuality. We are leaving our personal opinions at the door and focusing entirely on the strict Freudian analysis presented in the text.
And the most logical place to begin this deconstruction is by looking at the core architecture of desire.
Okay.
Before we can understand how Freud breaks down human sexuality, we have to understand the specific terminology he uses to measure it.
Right. He needs a baseline.
Exactly. Science needed a term to quantify the actual flowing energy of the sexual instinct, and the term they adopted is libido.
Libido is one of those words that has been completely hijacked by pop culture. We throw it around today like it just means being in the mood.
Yeah, like a casual feeling.
But Freud is using it as a strict unit of measurement, isn't he?
He is. He's treating it almost like a thermodynamic concept. Freud draws a direct, crucial analogy to the instinct of nutrition.
Like eating.
Right. In everyday language, we use the word hunger to describe the biological instinct for nutrition. Science needed an exact counterpart word for the sexual instinct.
So libido is utilized as a quantitative measure of instinctual energy.
It is the raw power driving the system. Now, the problem Freud immediately identifies is that popular opinion, both in his time and honestly largely in ours, has completely calcified and entirely false ideas about how this instinct operates.
Yeah, popular opinion treats it like a magical biological switch. The prevailing non-scientific narrative goes something like this. The sexual instinct is completely 100% absent in childhood.
Children are seen as pure asexual beings.
Right. Then suddenly puberty hits. The physical body matures, and this instinct magically switches on.
And society dictates that this newly awakened instinct is an irresistible, almost magnetic attraction exercised by one sex upon the opposite sex.
With the ultimate biological goal being sexual union and reproduction.
Boy meets girl, biology takes the wheel, and they unite. Freud points out that this is essentially a poetic fable.
A fable. Wow.
Yeah, he even explicitly references the old Platonic myth found in the Symposium.
Oh, right, the idea that original human beings were complete spheres.
Exactly, and then they were later cut into two halves, man and woman, who are now doomed to spend their lives endlessly striving to reunite with their missing half.
Which is romantic, it is culturally comforting, and according to Freud, it is scientifically absurd.
Completely absurd. So Freud steps up to this massive, culturally entrenched illusion and just takes a sledgehammer to it.
He argues that if you actually look at the true situation through scientifically sifted observation, if you look at how people actually behave in reality, not how they're supposed to behave in poems, that popular view is riddled with errors, inaccuracies, and incredibly hasty conclusions.
And to dismantle this illusion, Freud introduces two critical technical terms that form the entire basis of this chapter.
Okay, let's get into those.
The first term is the sexual object. Simply put, this is the person, or the thing, from whom the sexual attraction proceeds.
So it is the target that the libido is drawn toward.
Right. And the second term is the sexual aim. This is the specific physical act or process towards which the instinct tends.
The ultimate action the libido wants to complete to discharge its energy.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this distinction is everything. The object is the who or the what. The aim is the what we want to do about it.
That is the perfect distillation. And what Freud discovers through relentless clinical observation is that there are massive, widespread, and deeply entrenched deviations in respect of both the sexual object and the sexual aim.
People constantly desire objects that do not fit the popular boy meets girl narrative in the slightest.
And they relentlessly seek out aims that have absolutely nothing to do with genital union.
Here is where I want to introduce an analogy, because getting your head around this separation is crucial. Think back to Freud's own analogy of hunger.
It's a great comparison.
Right. If the instinct for nutrition hunger is a homing missile, it is rigidly programmed at the factory to hit one single target, which is food. If you are starving, you cannot satisfy that hunger by listening to a beautiful symphony or by taking a nap or by looking at a painting. The missile needs food. The payload is digestion.
The biological imperative of hunger is incredibly rigid in its demands.
Exactly. And popular opinion assumes the libido works the exact same way. It assumes the libido is a homing missile, hardwired to hit a specific target, the opposite sex with a specific payload, which is reproduction.
But Freud looks at the clinical data and realizes the libido is a completely different kind of missile.
He is saying the libido is modular.
Highly modular. The targeting system, the sexual object, and the payload, the sexual aim, can be completely swapped out, modified, detached, or replaced without the missile losing its power.
That modularity is the terrifying and brilliant core of Freud's thesis. But, recognizing that modularity forces us to ask a difficult question. If the object and the aim are actually separate, distinct components, if they're not biologically forged as one single immutable piece of hardware, why do we all naturally assume they are one biological package? How do they normally function together?
What's fascinating here is Freud's answer to this. It's one of the most vivid metaphors in the text. He concludes that the sexual instinct and the sexual object are merely soldered together.
Soldered is such a deliberate mechanical word choice by Strachey. in translating Freud.
It really is. Solder implies two distinct pieces of metal joined by a completely different material through the application of heat. It is a bond, but it is not a unified creation.
So we only assume they form one unified biological imperative because of the sheer statistical uniformity of the normal picture.
Exactly. Most of the time, the instinct and the object align in the way biology expects for the purpose of reproduction.
Because this alignment happens so frequently, we develop a massive blind spot. We are in danger of completely overlooking the seam where the two pieces are joined.
But when Freud studies what his contemporaries termed aberrations, he observes the solder breaking.
The heat of psychological conflict or the presence of innate alternative dispositions just melts that bond.
And this leads to his most crucial warning early in the text. We must proactively loosen the bond that exists in our thoughts between instinct and object.
The sexual instinct is, in its first instance, completely independent of its object.
That is a staggering paradigm shift for 1905. He is arguing that the drive, the raw libido, exists and flows before the target is even acquired.
The engine is running before the steering wheel is connected.
Exactly. To prove this detachment, Freud starts walking us through the deviations, starting chronologically with deviations in respect of the sexual object.
Right, and he tackles the most prominent deviation of his era, which the medical text termed inversion.
Yes. Inversion is the clinical term used throughout the text for homosexuality. Freud notes how it comes as a profound shock to the popular poetic view to learn that there are vast numbers of men whose exclusive sexual object is a man and women whose exclusive sexual object is a woman.
But rather than just observing it, he immediately acts like a botanist, categorizing new flora, doesn't he?
He does. He categorizes these inverts to demonstrate the sheer breadth and spectrum of this deviation.
He refuses to treat it as a monolith. He breaks it down into three distinct, highly specific types.
The first categorization is the absolute invert. For these individuals, their sexual objects are exclusively of their own sex.
So persons of the opposite sex leave them entirely cold or even arouse active sexual aversion.
Right. Freud notes that in males of this category, heterosexual acts are either completely impossible to perform, or if they are performed, they bring absolutely no enjoyment due to this underlying aversion.
They are completely magnetically polarized in one single direction. The solder is firmly attached, just to a different object.
The second category introduces nuance, the amphigenic invert. Freud also refers to them as psychosexual hermaphrodites.
Oh, interesting term.
Yeah. For this group, the sexual object may equally well be of their own or of the opposite sex. This kind of inversion entirely lacks the characteristic of exclusiveness.
We would term this bisexuality today. It's a libido that isn't restricted by the gender of the object at all. It's an equal opportunity targeting system.
And then we arrive at the third category, which is perhaps the most disruptive to the medical consensus of the time, the contingent invert.
Contingent, meaning situational.
Exactly. For these individuals, under certain external conditions, the chief ones being the sudden inaccessibility of any normal sexual object, or through the power of imitation, they become entirely capable of taking someone of their own sex as a sexual object and deriving genuine satisfaction from it.
He explicitly mentions environments like detention in prison or the intense comradeship of military service during war.
Right. If the standard object is removed from the environment, the libido simply finds a new object.
It doesn't shut down and wait. It adapts to whatever's available.
Freud also observes that inverts themselves possess incredibly varied views of their own instinct. Some accept their inversion as perfectly natural, insisting it is just as legitimate and biologically sound as the normal attitude.
While others rebel against it intensely, feeling it as a pathological compulsion that they wish they could be rid of.
The timeline of when it appears varies wildly too. For some absolute inverts, they can trace it back to their earliest childhood memories.
For others, it suddenly appears before or after puberty.
It can persist tenaciously throughout life, go into temporary abeyance, or even act as a temporary episode on the way to normal development.
This sheer variety, the fact that inversion is so fluid, so diverse in its presentation, leads Freud to make one of the most important arguments in this entire text.
He methodically takes aim at the absolute medical consensus of his day regarding inversion, and he utterly destroys it.
You are referring to the medical establishment's myth of degeneracy.
Exactly. The early medical observers, people like Krafft-Ebing, whom Freud heavily references, first encountered inversion almost exclusively in psychiatric patients.
They were studying people suffering from severe nervous diseases in clinical settings.
So, through a massive selection bias, they automatically linked inversion with nervous degeneracy. They assumed it was a biological defect, a symptom of a fundamentally degenerate, rotting nervous system.
Freud attacks this attribution of degeneracy on multiple devastating fronts.
First, he points out the inherent logical flaw in how the medical community was using the word itself. Degeneracy had become a fashionable catch-all label for any symptom not directly caused by physical trauma or infection.
Freud questions if throwing this label at a patient actually adds a single drop of knowledge to our understanding.
He argues that the term degenerate should only be applied if several serious, crippling deviations from the normal are found together, and if the patient's capacity for survival and efficient functioning are severely impaired.
And he points out, using blatant historical and contemporary facts, that inverts do not meet those criteria of impairment at all.
Not in the slightest. Freud lists concrete facts that make the degeneracy label intellectually impossible to justify.
Let's hear them.
First, inversion is routinely found in people who exhibit absolutely no other serious deviations from the normal. Second, and crucially, it is found in people whose efficiency in the real world is entirely unimpaired.
In fact, Freud goes out of his way to note that inverts are frequently distinguished by exceptionally high intellectual development and profound ethical culture.
He makes a point of mentioning that some of the most prominent, culturally significant men in all of recorded human history were inverts.
You cannot call the architects of human culture degenerates who are unfit for survival.
He then casts his net even wider, looking beyond European medical practice and bringing in anthropological and historical data.
He points out that inversion was a frequent phenomenon, almost an institution equipped with important societal functions among the ancient civilizations at the absolute peak of their cultural and military power.
He's looking directly at ancient Greece and ancient Rome, cultures that essentially built the foundation of Western civilization.
He also notes it is remarkably widespread among many primitive races.
Right, because the concept of degeneracy is traditionally restricted by medicine to states of high, perhaps over-refined civilization. Yet here is inversion existing outside of that entirely in both the ancient world and in primitive societies.
Therefore, by pure logical deduction, inversion cannot be a sign of nervous degeneracy.
It is a devastatingly logical takedown of his peers. He systematically removes the stigma of disease from the condition.
But once he removes that label, he is still left with the burning question: where does inversion actually come from? If it isn't a brain disease, what is it?
This leads directly into a massive, heavily theoretical debate in the text between two opposing camps. Is inversion innate or is it acquired?
The innate camp argued that a person is simply born with their sexual instinct permanently soldered to a particular object.
This was heavily supported by absolute inverts themselves, who swore they had never, even in their earliest memories, felt heterosexual desire.
But Freud points out that this purely innate theory completely fails to explain the amphigenic and, more importantly, the contingent inverts.
Exactly. How can a trait that only appears situationally, like in a prison environment, be entirely innate?
But the acquired camp has massive glaring holes in its logic, too.
The acquired camp argued that early sexual impressions or potent external influences like exclusive same-sex environments, early seduction, or even a traumatic fear of heterosexual intercourse determine the inversion.
And Freud counters this by pointing out a simple statistical reality. Countless people are subjected to those exact same external influences.
Countless boys go to same-sex boarding schools or experience early seductions without ever becoming inverted.
So neither theory works in isolation. The accidental external influences aren't strong enough to cause it without some kind of internal biological cooperation.
And a purely innate theory ignores the proven flexibility of the libido in contingent cases.
To solve this apparent paradox, Freud turns away from pure psychology and looks at anatomy.
He introduces the concept of bisexuality. Science had long known about anatomical hermaphroditism in rare cases, where physical genitals combine male and female characteristics.
But Freud points to a much more universal fact.
Yeah.
A certain degree of anatomical hermaphroditism occurs normally in every human being.
In every normal male or female, there are rudimentary, atrophied physical traces of the apparatus of the opposite sex.
Biologically speaking, every single human fetus starts with the hardware blueprints for both sexes before specializing.
This anatomical reality suggests an originally bisexual physical disposition in human evolution that gradually modifies into a unisexual one during development.
Now, earlier theorists tried to take this physical fact and map it directly onto the mind.
They claimed inversion was simply a feminine brain trapped in a masculine body, a literal psychical hermaphroditism.
But Freud pushes back against that direct one-to-one mapping. He doesn't buy that a male invert just has a female brain.
He argues we're completely ignorant of what physically characterizes a feminine brain. You cannot just take a complex psychological problem and conveniently replace it with a theoretical anatomical one.
There is no regular, predictable parallel between physical hermaphroditism and mental inversion.
A man can possess the most complete, unyielding mental masculinity in every other aspect of his life and still be an absolute invert.
Let me pause on the target of the inverted desire, because this is where the text gets incredibly granular and fascinating.
It does.
The old theory assumed a male invert, having a female brain, was actively looking for a highly masculine man, just like a heterosexual woman would.
But Freud points out that reality doesn't match this. Look at his analysis of male prostitutes in ancient Greece.
He points out that these prostitutes actively mimicked women in their clothing, their grooming, and their behavior.
So is the invert actually looking for a man, or are they looking for a strange reflection of themselves?
That is one of the most profound observations Freud makes in this section.
He notes that in ancient Greece, what excited an older man's love was often not the masculine character of a young boy, but rather his physical resemblance to a woman, combined with feminine mental qualities like shyness, submissiveness, and a need for instruction.
The paramount condition was that the object's physical body, specifically the genitals, had to be masculine, but the overall presentation was a psychological compromise.
Freud states that the sexual object in these cases is not a true opposite, but a kind of reflection of the subject's own bisexual nature.
It is a profound psychological compromise. The libido is negotiating between the masculine requirement of the genitals and the feminine requirement of the presentation.
And he notes a parallel paradox in women, doesn't he?
He observes that active inverted women often exhibit striking masculine characteristics, both physical and mental.
Yet, paradoxically, they actively look for profound femininity in their sexual objects. This highlights the sheer complexity of psychical hermaphroditism. It is not a simple, clean reversal of gender roles.
Freud doesn't leave the debate there. In later additions to the text, he finally brings his own specific psychoanalytic findings to bear on this innate versus acquired debate. He finds the missing link.
He suggests that while there is an undeniable innate bisexual disposition in all humans, psychoanalysis reveals the specific, acquired psychological mechanisms that lock inversion into place.
In the cases he personally examined, he found that future inverts pass through a very specific phase in early childhood.
They experience a period of incredibly intense fixation on a woman, almost universally the mother.
An overwhelmingly intense early maternal fixation.
But then a crucial pivot occurs. Following this intense fixation, they undergo a process of identification.
Instead of maintaining the mother as the external object of their desire, they identify themselves with the woman.
They subconsciously take themselves as their own sexual object. This leads to what Freud terms a narcissistic object choice.
They seek out young men who resemble themselves physically or mentally so that they may love these young men in the exact way their mother loved them.
I want to make sure we truly grasp the mechanics of this because it's stunning. They aren't just loving a man, they are subconsciously playing the role of their own mother, loving a proxy of their past infantile self.
It is a psychological mirroring act that perfectly bridges the gap between the innate bisexual hardware they were born with and the acquired early childhood experience they lived through.
It resolves the innate versus acquired debate by proving both are essential. And Freud concludes this entire section on inversion with a vital takeaway, repeating his earlier warning.
We are forced, again, to loosen the bond in our thoughts between instinct and object.
The instinct is completely independent of its object.
Which brings us to the next logical progression in our deep dive. If the libido can so easily detach from the opposite sex and attach to the same sex, how much further can it stretch? What are the absolute limits of this flexibility?
Freud moves into territory that was and remains deeply taboo. He examines the extreme deviations of the object sexually immature persons, which is pedophilia and animals or bestiality.
Freud approaches these extremely sensitive topics with the exact same strict, unyielding clinical neutrality he applied to inversion.
He is not judging, he is cataloging. He notes that choosing children as exclusive sexual objects is rare. It usually occurs as a sporadic aberration rather than a lifelong absolute fixation.
Under what conditions does the text say this typically occurs?
Freud observes it usually happens when a person is characterized by a fundamental cowardice or when they have become sexually impotent and adopt children as an unresisting substitute.
Most critically, it occurs when an urgent instinct, a libido that has built up such tension it will not allow for postponement, cannot get possession of a more appropriate object at that moment in time.
If we bring back our homing missile analogy or the hunger analogy, the contrast here is staggering.
If hunger operated with this level of extreme, desperate flexibility, we would eat literally anything when starving: wood, dirt, metal.
But hunger, even in starvation, retains its objects far more energetically than the libido does. Hunger is fiercely stubborn. Libido, as Freud paints it, is terrifyingly flexible.
Freud specifically uses the word cheapening. The sexual instinct permits a cheapening of its objects that the instinct for nutrition would only permit in the most extreme, borderline fatal instances of starvation.
The libido will accept an inferior substitute rather than remain unfulfilled. And he applies the exact same logic to sexual intercourse with animals, noting that sexual attraction seems perfectly able to override even the fundamental biological barriers of species.
Human nature being what it is, society desperately wants to label these extreme deviations as pure, unadulterated insanity.
We want to believe that only a structurally broken brain could do this, because that makes us feel safe.
But Freud absolutely refuses to grant us that aesthetic and moral comfort. He states plainly that we cannot ascribe these severe aberrations purely to insanity.
Clinical experience shows that disturbances of the sexual instinct among the insane do not differ in kind from those among the healthy. The insane merely display them without the usual social inhibitions.
He makes a point of highlighting that these acts happen in otherwise normal, functioning populations.
He points out the uncomfortable truth that the sexual abuse of children is found with uncanny frequency among school teachers and child attendants, not because they are inherently insane, but simply because they have the easiest, most frequent opportunity for it when the libido demands a cheapened object.
And bestiality is not rare among country populations who live in close, isolated proximity to animals. The boundary between the normal and the aberrant is entirely porous.
If we can't blame this extreme flexibility on insanity, what is Freud suggesting this reveals about human civilization and the architecture of the mind?
Freud theorizes that the impulses of sexual life are among those which, even normally, are the absolute least controlled by the higher activities of the mind.
He notes a paradox. Anyone who is socially or ethically abnormal is almost invariably abnormal in their sexual life.
But conversely, many people who are entirely normal in every other respect, who have passed successfully through the entire arduous process of human cultural development and moral education, remain entirely abnormal in their sexual life.
Sexuality remains the fundamental weak spot in human cultural development. The higher brain functions can conquer almost everything else, but they struggle to tame the libido.
The profound, overarching takeaway from this entire first section on the sexual object is this. Under a great number of conditions, and in surprisingly numerous individuals, the nature and importance of the sexual object completely recedes into the background.
What is essential, what is constant, is the sexual instinct itself.
The drive is the only constant. The target is entirely interchangeable. That perfectly wraps up the deviations of the who or the what.
But now the text makes a major pivot.
Freud moves from the object to the aim. We are exploring deviations in respect to the sexual aim. We know what the libido wants to hit, but what does it actually want to do once it gets there?
To analyze deviations, we must first establish Freud's definition of the normal sexual aim. For Freud, the normal aim is regarded strictly as the union of the genitals in the act of copulation.
This act leads to a massive release of sexual tension and a temporary extinction of the sexual instinct, a process perfectly analogous to sating hunger by eating a meal.
But getting to that normal aim isn't instantaneous. It involves a journey, a sequence of events.
Even in the most utterly normal, biologically standard sexual process, there are intermediate relations to the object.
Touching the object and looking at the object. Freud calls these actions preliminary sexual aims.
They are accompanied by their own distinct pleasure, but their primary function is to intensify the excitation, building the tension that pushes the subject toward the final aim of genital union.
He brings up kissing as the prime example of a preliminary aim, right?
The kiss is fascinating to Freud. It is a highly respected, culturally ubiquitous sexual act among civilized nations.
Yet, mechanically speaking, it involves the mucous membranes of the lips and mouth parts of the body that do not belong to the primary sexual apparatus at all, but rather serve as the entrance to the digestive tract.
The kiss provides Freud with the perfect point of contact between normal sexual life and perversions.
How does he classify perversions of the aim based on that point of contact?
He classifies perversions of the aim as activities which fall into two distinct categories. First, activities which extend in an anatomical sense beyond the regions of the body specifically designed for sexual union.
Second, activities which linger over the intermediate relations to the sexual object, refusing to move past them to the final aim.
Let's tackle that first category, anatomical extensions. Why does the libido want to extend beyond the genitals? Why isn't it satisfied with the primary apparatus?
Freud introduces a powerful psychological concept here called the psychical overvaluation of the sexual object.
When you desire someone, that appreciation rarely stops short at their genitals.
The psychological valuation bleeds outward. It extends to their whole body, and it even extends into the psychological sphere. You become intellectually infatuated, submitting to their judgments with credulity, assuming they're smarter and better than they objectively are.
It's the clinical explanation for love is blind. You overvalue everything associated with them.
This sexual overvaluation makes it practically very difficult to restrict the sexual aim solely to the genitals. The libido seeks to consume the entirety of the overvalued object.
This helps turn activities connected with other parts of the body into primary sexual aims. Freud specifically examines the sexual use of the mucous membrane of the lips and mouth and the anal orifice.
And here is where we hit a massive innate psychological barrier that the mind throws up to stop this extension: disgust.
Disgust is an incredibly potent mechanism in Freudian theory. The use of the mouth as a sexual organ in contact with another's genitals is often condemned by society as a perversion, specifically because it triggers an unmistakable visceral feeling of disgust.
Freud argues this disgust acts as a conventional limit, an evolutionary or cultural force designed to restrict the sexual aim to its proper biological channel.
But the libido, powered by that overvaluation, can overpower the disgust protocol.
The sexual instinct, in its strength, actively enjoys overriding this disgust. Freud gives a brilliant, simple example that perfectly illustrates how irrational this mechanism is.
A man who will passionately kiss a pretty girl's mouth feels absolutely no disgust whatsoever. Yet that exact same man might be profoundly disgusted at the idea of using her toothbrush.
It makes zero hygienic sense. The oral cavity isn't magically cleaner than the bristles of the toothbrush. If anything, it's the opposite.
But the brain, hijacked by the libido, selectively turns off the disgust switch, specifically for the kiss, while leaving it active for the toothbrush.
Disgust interferes with the libidinal overvaluation, but the libido has a sheer voltage to override it. Freud then extends this analysis to the sexual use of the anal orifice.
He knows it is, again, disgust that stamps this aim as a severe perversion. But he completely dismisses the rationalization that this disgust is purely illogical, just because the organ serves for excretion.
He points out that hysterical girls often feel the exact same profound disgust for the male genital because it serves to void urine. The disgust is psychological, not purely hygienic.
He also takes a moment to clarify a major misconception about anal sexuality and inversion, doesn't he?
He makes a very deliberate point of stating that the playing of a sexual part by the mucous membrane of the anus is by no means limited to intercourse between men. It is not exclusively characteristic of inverted feeling.
In fact, he suggests that its use in male inversion likely owes its origin to an analogy with a similar act performed with a woman. The anatomical extension exists independently of the gender of the object.
Anatomical extensions are essentially the libido claiming other parts of the body as pseudogenitals. But what happens when the libido abandons the person entirely?
When the overvaluation detaches from the human being and latches onto a thing, let's talk about fetishism.
Fetishism represents a fascinating category where the normal sexual object is replaced by another that bears some tangential relation to it, but is entirely unsuited to serve the normal sexual aim.
We are talking about completely unsuitable substitutes.
The substitute can be a part of the physical body that is utterly inappropriate for sexual purposes, like a foot or hair. Or it can be an inanimate object that bears an assignable relation to the person, preferably to their sexuality, like a piece of clothing, shoes, or underlinen.
Freud notes the psychological comparison to savages who genuinely believe their gods are embodied in inanimate fetishes. The object becomes imbued with immense irrational power.
But Freud makes sure to point out that a mild form of fetishism is completely normal, expected behavior, doesn't he?
He does. The point of contact with the normal is, again, that psychological overvaluation. If you deeply overvalue the person, you naturally overvalue what is associated with them.
A certain degree of fetishism is habitually present in normal romantic love, wanting to keep a lock of a lover's hair, or treasuring an article of their clothing when they are away. This is especially true when the normal sexual aim seems temporarily unattainable.
So when does keeping a lover's sweater cross the line into clinical pathology?
The situation only becomes pathological when the longing for the fetish passes beyond being merely a necessary condition attached to the object and actually takes the place of the normal aim entirely.
Furthermore, it becomes truly pathological when the fetish completely detaches from a particular individual and becomes the sole sexual object itself.
Exclusiveness and fixation are the hallmarks of pathology. When the shoe replaces the partner, you have a perversion.
But how does something like a foot or a shoe become the target in the first place? Why those specific objects? Freud engages with the theories of Alfred Binet to figure out the timeline of this fixation.
Binet maintained that the choice of a fetish is simply an after effect of some potent sexual impression received in early childhood. A lasting first impression, like imprinting.
And in early editions of this text, Freud agreed with Binet. But through deeper, more extensive psychoanalytic research, Freud revises this theory.
He found that all these supposedly early memories of the fetish already arousing sexual interest actually related to a time after the age of 5 or 6.
Which, in Freudian time, is practically middle age for the development of the libido. If it's happening at age 6, it's not the true origin.
Psychoanalysis makes it highly doubtful that fresh, fundamental pathological fixations occurred that late in development.
So Freud realizes that behind the very first conscious recollection of the fetish, there lies a submerged, entirely forgotten phase of early infantile sexual development.
The fetish acts as a screen memory. It is a conscious symbol that represents this repressed infantile phase and is a precipitate of it.
When I was reading this part about the repressed infantile phase behind a foot or hair fetish, Freud lost me for a second. He blames it on a repressed coprophilic pleasure in smelling.
That feels like a massive leap.
Walk me through exactly how he justifies connecting a foot to infantile smelling.
It requires following the instinctual energy as it transforms. Freud suggests that the choice of a foot or hair fetish involves an innate coprophilic pleasure in smelling, an interest in strong bodily odors that was intensely present in early childhood.
However, as the child is socialized, this urge is fiercely repressed by disgust. Both feet and hair are objects that retain strong smells.
They are exalted into fetishes after the raw, direct olfactory sensation becomes unpleasurable and taboo to the conscious mind and is abandoned. The fetish is a sanitized compromise.
There is also a visual component specifically to the foot fetish, tied to a very bizarre childhood theory of anatomy.
Freud notes that the scopophilic instinct, the instinct to look seeking to reach the genitals from underneath, is brought to an abrupt halt in its pathway by social prohibition and repression. It stops at the foot or the shoe.
And this ties into a universal childhood sexual theory where the child inherently expects the female to possess a penis.
The foot subconsciously represents the female penis, the absence of which is deeply felt and feared by the childish mind due to castration anxiety. The foot becomes a reassuring substitute.
To bring this back to earth with an analogy, it is like seeing a movie trailer that is so obsession-worthy, so heavily coated with symbols, that a person refuses to ever go to the theater and watch the actual film.
The preliminary step completely hijacks the final destination.
A very apt analogy. The preparatory act, the symbol, becomes the entirety of the sexual experience.
This perfectly bridges us to Section 5, lingering on the path. We've talked about substituting the object. Now let's talk about getting stuck on the preliminary actions, looking, touching, and cruelty.
If the libido can get stuck on a shoe, it can definitely get stuck on the act of looking.
We noted earlier that touching and looking are entirely normal preliminary aims. Visual impressions remain the absolute most frequent pathway for libidinal excitation.
Normally, this looking scopophilia increases tension, driving the subject toward copulation. Freud also notes this instinct can be sublimated.
Sublimated meaning the energy is channeled away from sex and into something culturally productive or artistic.
Sexual curiosity essentially seeks to complete the sexual object by revealing its hidden parts. But this powerful visual curiosity can be diverted in the direction of art if the interest shifts away from the genitals specifically and onto the shape of the body as a whole.
The appreciation of classical sculpture is a sublimation of scopophilia.
But when does looking devolve into a perversion?
It becomes a perversion, manifesting as voyeurism or exhibitionism under 3 specific conditions. First, if it is restricted exclusively to the genitals, ignoring the rest of the person.
Second, if it is connected with the overriding of disgust. such as looking at excretory functions.
Or third, if instead of being preparatory, it supplants the final normal aim completely. Freud notes a fascinating symmetry here. Exhibitionists, for instance, exhibit their own genitals specifically in order to obtain a reciprocal view of the other person's genitals.
It's almost like a really terrible, inappropriate barter system in their subconscious. I'll show you mine if you show me yours, locked in as an absolute necessity.
And just as disgust blocks oral extensions, there is a specific force that opposes looking right.
The psychological force that stands in opposition to scopophilia is shame. Just like disgust, the libido gathers its energy and actively overrides shame to achieve its aim.
Now we arrive at what is perhaps the most significant and definitely the darkest of the perversions: sadism and masochism.
Krafft-Ebing originally coined these terms. Sadism for the active form, the desire to inflict pain, and masochism for the passive form.
Other medical writers preferred the term algolonia, emphasizing the pleasure derived directly from pain, whereas Krafft-Ebing's terms emphasize the pleasure derived from humiliation, mastery, or subjection.
Let's start with sadism, the active form. Where does the desire to inflict pain stem from in normal, non-pathological psychology?
Freud argues that the roots of sadism are surprisingly easy to detect in the normal. The sexuality of most male human beings contains a clear element of aggressiveness, a desire to subjugate.
The biological significance of this seems to lie in the evolutionary need for overcoming the resistance of the sexual object by means other than gentle wooing.
Sadism is simply this innate, aggressive component of the sexual instinct becoming independent, becoming exaggerated, and ultimately usurping the leading position by displacement.
The aggressiveness stops serving the sexual act and becomes the sexual act itself. But it only becomes a true clinical perversion when satisfaction is entirely conditional on the humiliation and maltreatment of the object.
Correct. And then we have its passive counterpart, masochism. This comprises any passive attitude toward sexual life where satisfaction is strictly conditional upon suffering physical or mental pain at the hands of the sexual object.
Freud originally debated whether masochism was ever a primary phenomenon or if it was always secondary.
Because it seems so fundamentally counterintuitive to biology to actively seek pain. Pain is the ultimate warning system.
He initially argued that clinical analysis shows masochism is often nothing more than an extension of sadism turned round upon the subject's own self.
The subject literally takes the place of the sexual object in their own mind. Factors like the castration complex and a deeply seated unconscious sense of guilt combine to exaggerate and fixate this passive attitude.
And pain, in this context, acts just like disgust and shame. It is a biological resistance that the libido have to break through to generate tension. But hold on, there's a massive contradiction in the text here.
Earlier, we established that the libido is modular and flexible, that parts can operate independently.
But here, Freud notes that these impulses occur in pairs. A sadist is always simultaneously a masochist in their unconscious. It's like a coin. You can't have heads without tails. Why are they inexorably linked if everything else is so detached?
That is a brilliant observation, and it delves into the deepest theory in the chapter. First, regarding the connection between cruelty and sex. Freud states that an intimate primal connection exists between cruelty and the sexual instinct.
Cruelty comes easily to the childish nature, because the capacity for pity, the psychological obstacle that halts the instinct for mastery when facing another's pain, develops very late in childhood.
The aggressive element might even be a relic of cannibalistic desires derived from the older primal instinct for obtaining mastery over the environment.
So cruelty is a primitive biological baseline, and pity is a civilized, acquired overlay.
Now, regarding the pairing of opposites, Freud observes that a person who feels pleasure in producing pain is also fundamentally capable of enjoying pain inflicted upon themselves.
The active and passive forms are habitually, universally found together in the same individual. Anyone who is an exhibitionist in their unconscious is, at the same time, a voyeur.
Why? What forces them to be paired?
Freud suggests that the existence of these pairs of opposites, sadism and masochism, exhibitionism and scopophilia, cannot be attributed merely to aggressiveness.
We must connect the simultaneous presence of these active and passive opposites with the opposing masculinity and femininity which are combined in human bisexuality.
The physiological anatomical bisexuality we discussed earlier, the fact that we carry hardware for both sexes, expresses itself psychologically as a pairing of active and passive instinctual components.
That brings the whole theory full circle. We have both sets of hardware anatomically, so we have both active and passive software running simultaneously in our unconscious mind.
Precisely. And this realization leads Freud to a massive, sweeping conclusion about perversions in general. He notes that the disposition to perversions is not a rare anomaly.
It is an original and universal disposition of the human sexual instinct. The components for every perversion are there in everyone.
Perversions are simply the normal sexual instinct failing to synthesize, falling apart into its constituent components.
Which brings us to the ultimate pivot point of this entire deep dive. Up until now, we have been looking at people whose sexual objects and aims are manifestly, visibly abnormal. The inverts, the fetishists, the sadists.
But the narrative makes a crucial pivot. How do we study the sexual instinct in those who appear completely normal in their actions, but who suffer mentally? We are entering the territory of the sexual instinct in neurotics.
To understand this pivot, we must look at the specific findings of psychoanalysis, specifically the therapeutic procedure introduced by Joseph Breuer and Freud, initially known as the cathartic method.
They were treating a very specific class of patients, psychoneurotics, those suffering from hysteria and obsessional neurosis.
We need to define this for the listener. These are people suffering from mysterious physical and mental symptoms, hysterical paralysis of an arm, sudden blindness, inescapable obsessive thoughts, with absolutely no underlying organic medical cause.
The nerves are fine, but the arm won't move.
Freud outlines a massive revolutionary revelation derived from years of applying psychoanalysis to these patients. All these psychoneuroses are based entirely on sexual instinctual forces.
He doesn't just mean sex plays a minor part, or that stress exacerbates it. He is dogmatic about this.
He expressly, unequivocally asserts that the energy of the sexual instinct is the most important, and the only constant source of energy maintaining the neurotic symptoms.
The symptoms literally constitute the sexual activity of the patient. The illness is a substitute for sex.
Okay, we need to walk through the mechanics of how that is even physically possible. How does a sexual impulse turn into a paralyzed arm or an obsessive thought?
It operates through two sequential mechanisms: repression and conversion. When a patient, particularly a hysteric, is faced with a sexual situation or an internal libidinal impulse that causes intense moral conflict, usually because of an excessive aversion to sexuality and overdevelopment of shame or disgust, they employ a defense mechanism called repression.
They violently block the thought from their conscious mind.
They hold the mental processes and wishes back in a state of unconsciousness. They refuse to acknowledge the desire. But the thermodynamic energy of that instinct, the libido, does not vanish just because it is ignored.
Being held back, it builds pressure. It strives to obtain an expression appropriate to its emotional importance. It needs to discharge.
So in hysteria, it finds this expression through the process of conversion. The purely mental energy is converted into somatic physical phenomena, the hysterical symptoms.
Imagine a massive river representing the libido. The patient builds a gigantic dam of shame, disgust, and social morality across it. The libido doesn't just evaporate.
The pressure builds exponentially, it sleds backward, and eventually it bursts through the plumbing of the house as a symptom. A physical leak is masking a psychological flood.
That is the exact dynamic. The symptom is a substitute, a physical transcription for the repressed sexual wish.
And the psychoanalytic method cures this by systematically turning these physical symptoms back into conscious ideas, effectively dismantling the dam and allowing the energy to dissipate normally.
But here is the absolute bombshell of this chapter. When Freud traces these hysterical symptoms back to their source, when he drains the floodwaters, he finds that the repressed sexuality isn't just normal, vanilla heterosexual desire, is it?
It is not. Psychoanalysis shows unequivocally that symptoms are not formed exclusively at the cost of the so-called normal sexual instinct. They give expression to instincts that would be described as severely perverse if they were acted out consciously.
This leads to Freud's most famous world-changing thesis from this entire chapter. Neuroses are, so to say, the negative of the perversions.
The negative of the perversions, like an old photographic negative, where the active pervert acts out the impulse in reality, they indulge the fetish, they act on the sadism, the neurotic represses that exact same impulse, and it emerges inverted as a symptom of suffering.
The symptoms are formed at the cost of abnormal sexuality. Freud states that the sexual instinct of psychoneurotics exhibits, in repression, all the aberrations we just studied.
Let's break down exactly what he found lurking in the unconscious of these ostensibly normal patients.
First, the unconscious mental life of all neurotics, without exception, shows inverted impulses, a fixation of libido upon persons of their own sex. An unconscious tendency to homosexuality is never absent in a neurotic, and it is a vital driving factor in symptom formation, particularly in hysteria.
So latent inversion is universally present in neurosis. What else is hiding down there?
Second, it is possible to trace tendencies to every kind of anatomical extension. The unconscious mind of the neurotic routinely assigns the role of genitals to the mucous membranes of the mouth and anus, and these repressed tendencies directly form symptoms, like hysterical vomiting or digestive obsessions.
The oral and anal deviations are operating at full capacity beneath the surface.
Third, and this is crucial for understanding the suffering of the neurotic, the component instincts play a prominent role, mostly emerging as those pairs of opposites we discussed: the scopophilic instincts and exhibitionism, and the active and passive forms of cruelty, sadism, and masochism.
The contribution of cruelty is essential to understanding the fact that neurotic symptoms actively involve suffering.
Because the repressed masochistic impulse is being satisfied through the suffering of the neurotic symptom itself. The illness is the punishment and the pleasure combined into one terrible package.
Freud notes a remarkable symmetry in the unconscious here. In the unconscious of a neurotic, if an active instinct is present, its passive counterpart is regularly in operation as well. Every act of perversion is accompanied by its passive counterpart.
Furthermore, it is incredibly unusual for only a single perverse instinct to be developed in a neurotic. We usually find a considerable number of them, and traces of them all.
So the neurotic person is essentially a boiling cauldron of every conceivable perversion, but it is all trapped under a thick sheet of ice called repression. If neurosis is the negative of perversion, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the human mind is fundamentally, universally capable of every perversion. We're all built with these parts.
It proves that the disposition to perversions is not an anomaly, but a fundamental part of the normal constitution of all human beings. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle in Chapter 1, Section 7, Component Instincts and Erotogenic Zones.
To tie the biological reality to the psychological theory, Freud has to explain what actually powers these perversions and neuroses at a somatic bodily level.
We have these psychological mechanisms mapped out: repression, conversion, soldering. But where is the raw electricity actually coming from?
Freud must define what an instinct actually is. He defines it as the psychical representative of an endosomatic, continuously flowing source of stimulation. It contrasts with a stimulus, which is a single event coming from the outside world. The instinct exists on the frontier between the mental and the physical.
Wait, endosomatic. Let's translate that for a second. You mean it's literally coming from inside the body's organs, like a biological battery that never stops generating a charge?
Exactly that. The source of an instinct is a constant process of excitation occurring in an organ, and the aim of the instinct is the removal of this organic stimulus. Freud makes a provisional biological assumption that excitations of two kinds arise from somatic organs based on chemical differences.
One kind is specifically sexual, and the specific part of the skin or mucous membrane that produces this sexual excitation is called an erotogenic zone.
So the body has specific zones designed to act as generators for this libidinal electricity.
And the part played by these erotogenic zones is instantly obvious in the perversions that assign sexual significance to the oral and anal orifices. These orifices behave in every respect like a portion of the sexual apparatus because they are innate erotogenic zones.
In hysteria, these parts of the body become the seat of new sensations and changes in innervation that can be directly compared to a genital erection.
They literally act like substitute genitals because they are wired into the same electrical grid.
In hysteria, the significance of the erotogenic zones as apparatuses subordinate to the genitals is brilliantly clear. Freud even notes that the eye corresponds to an erotogenic zone for scopophilia, and the skin itself serves as the erotogenic zone for instincts involving pain and cruelty.
It is incredible to picture this. Freud is essentially mapping the human body as a landscape of latent sexual triggers, just waiting for the libido to activate them.
He is saying that the sexual instinct isn't a single monolithic drive that wakes up neatly at puberty. It's a Frankenstein's monster, stitched together from dozens of independent component instincts powered by different erotogenic zones across the body, and these components can break apart at any time.
That visual perfectly encapsulates what this analysis achieves. It utterly shatters the illusion of normal, unified sexuality. The normal sexual life of the adult is a highly precarious, fragile synthesis of these various component instincts.
If the synthesis fails, the components pursue their independent aims, resulting in perversions. If the synthesis is violently enforced by repression against strong components, the result is neurosis.
It's a precarious balancing act that we are all performing every single day. But Freud realizes that to truly find the root of this universal disposition, to see these component instincts in their raw, unsynthesized state, you can't just look at adults who have already built their dams.
You have to look at the only time in human life when these components act independently without the mask of societal morality.
You must look to the origins. You must look to childhood. The formula takes shape. The sexuality of neurotics has remained in or been brought back to an infantile state. To understand the adult, whether normal, perverse, or neurotic, we must turn our attention entirely to the sexual life of children.
In the upcoming Part 2, we will step into the most controversial and crucial phase of Freud's work, infantile sexuality and the transformations of puberty. We will explore thumb-sucking, infantile amnesia, autoerotism, the latency period, and how adult sexuality is built on the foundations of early childhood.
As we conclude this first deep dive, there is a profound implication hidden within Freud's mechanical dissection of the mind that requires our reflection, especially regarding how we view modern anxiety. We have learned that neuroses are the negative of perversions, created when the dam of shame, disgust, and morality represses our innate polymorphous instincts.
The river is blocked by society, and the house inevitably floods with symptoms.
Therefore, we are left with a haunting question about the nature of our world. If our social morality is built entirely upon the mandatory repression of these very instincts, is the price of a highly civilized society inevitably a widespread epidemic of neurosis? If our culture demands the damming of the river, are our modern anxieties, our hysterias, and our obsessive behaviors simply the unavoidable floodwaters of our own denied nature?
This is Part 2, the definitive concluding analysis of Freud's sexual theory.
And our focus today is locked onto the second major essay of this monumental work, which is Chapter 2, Infantile Sexuality.
That is the mission for this deep dive.
Yep. Today, we are going to systematically unpack infantile amnesia, the period of sexual latency, autoerotism, and masturbatory sexual manifestations.
A lot to cover, but it's also incredibly interconnected.
So to kick this off, we have to look at the environment Freud was actually writing in, because he is basically going to war with a massive society-wide blind spot.
Oh, absolutely. He's looking at the scientific community of the late 19th and early 20th century, and he points out this wild hypocrisy.
Right, because these are Victorian scientists who are completely obsessed with human origins.
Exactly. They are writing endless papers on what Freud calls phylogenesis, which is the evolutionary history of the species.
They want to know everything about our ancestors.
Yeah, but when it comes to a person's own prehistoric period, their childhood, what he calls ontogenesis, these same scientists suddenly cover their eyes.
It's so weird. The cognitive dissonance is staggering when you actually look at the historical context.
For centuries, the popular and scientific consensus was that childhood is this, sanitized period of total innocence, completely devoid of any sexual instincts.
Which is just crazy to think about now. The prevailing dogma was that these instincts lie entirely dormant, practically non-existent, and then miraculously awaken out of nowhere during puberty.
Right, driven solely by the biological maturation of the reproductive organs. That was the belief.
But Freud looks at this model and essentially says, this violates every law of biological development. Nature doesn't work in sudden, miraculous leaps.
No, it doesn't. He argues that this neglect of the infantile factor isn't just an oversight. It is an active, fierce societal taboo.
So I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a scientist back then. Is it just pure prudishness, like just Victorian moral standards saying we do not talk about children this way?
Well, that is the surface-level defense mechanism, certainly. The strict Victorian propriety provides the perfect cultural excuse not to look.
Makes sense.
But Freud diagnoses something much deeper at play. He argues that this systemic scientific neglect is actually driven by a collective psychological block. It's a species-wide denial.
Wait, really? A species-wide denial?
Yeah. If mankind had simply been able to learn from the direct, unbiased observation of children, Freud notes, he wouldn't have even needed to write these essays.
Because the evidence is just sitting right there.
Exactly. The evidence of infantile sexuality is everywhere. It's in nurseries, in pediatric clinics, in the daily lives of parents.
But the adults observing these children are projecting their own massive repressions onto the kids, right?
You nailed it. They refuse to see what is right in front of them, because acknowledging it in children would force them to acknowledge the primal, repressed urges within themselves.
Wow. So we have this society-wide refusal to look at childhood, Which brings us right back to that opening question we asked you, the listener, about infantile amnesia.
Right, why we all wipe our memories before age 6.
We just casually say, oh, I was too young to remember. But logically, the cognitive apparatus is fully functioning back then.
Oh, absolutely. Toddlers can speak multiple languages if exposed to them. They can memorize complex songs.
The brain is recording in 4K resolution, so where does the footage go?
Freud's monumental realization here is that there is no true abolition of these childhood impressions.
So they aren't just gone.
No, the memories haven't evaporated or decayed like old photographs. They have been forcefully, deliberately withheld from consciousness. They have been repressed.
Because the infantile period is filled with such deeply passionate reactions.
Yes.
Right?
Profound jealousies, intense physical sensations, wild emotional volatility. The child is just a creature of raw impulse.
But as the child grows and civilization begins to impose its structures, those raw impulses become fundamentally incompatible with the person they need to become to survive in society.
Exactly. They have to hide them.
So is infantile amnesia less like hard drive being erased and more like, say, a file being heavily encrypted?
That's a great way to put it.
Like, the operating system of our mind is still running on those files, dictating our behavior, setting our baseline anxieties, but we just don't have the administrative password to look at the raw data anymore.
That encryption analogy captures the exact mechanism Freud is describing. The files are absolutely still executing commands in the background.
That is so wild to think about.
And Freud takes this a crucial step further. He makes a direct mechanical connection between this baseline infantile amnesia and hysterical amnesia.
Hysterical amnesia, that's the phenomenon where adult neurotic patients completely forget traumatic events, right?
Yes. Freud argues that hysterical amnesia could not exist without infantile amnesia acting as the foundational architecture.
Okay, wait, walk me through the mechanics of that. Why does an adult's ability to repress a trauma at age 30 depend on them having forgotten their 5th birthday party?
Because repression doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It operates by associative links. Think of the unconscious mind as having a magnetic pull.
Okay, magnetic pull.
Yeah. When an adult experiences a trauma or an impulse that is too painful to process consciously, the mind needs a place to hide it.
Right.
That newly repressed material is pulled down into the unconscious because there is already a massive pre-existing reservoir of repressed childhood memories waiting there to anchor it.
Oh, wow. So the new trauma associates itself with the old, buried infantile impulses.
Exactly. It gets dragged down into that encrypted folder you mentioned. Without that foundational encryption of our first 6 years, the mind wouldn't have the mechanism or the gravity to repress later trauma.
So our entire childhood is rendered into a prehistoric epoch, basically, to build the very machinery of psychological defense.
That is exactly what Freud is saying.
Okay, if these early years are so wildly active, so passionate and highly charged, that we literally have to build an encrypted vault to contain them, why does there appear to be a lull before the storm of puberty?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because if you look at a typical 8-year-old, they aren't acting like a volatile toddler, but they also aren't acting like a hormonal teenager. There's a very distinct gap in development.
That gap is what Freud defines as the period of sexual latency.
Latency, okay.
It is a fascinating developmental plateau spanning roughly from age 5 or 6 up until puberty. During this time, the explosive development of the infantile sexual instincts halts.
It just stops.
Well, it's overtaken by a progressive, massive process of suppression. Freud uses the metaphor of building dams. The mind is constructing heavy infrastructure to restrict and block the flow of these primal instincts.
Mental dams. And he is very specific about the materials used to build these dams, right? He lists disgust, feelings of shame, and the claims of aesthetic and moral ideals.
Yes, those are the primary building blocks.
Now, looking at that list, my immediate reaction is that this is just parenting. This is education. Parents and teachers build the disgust and shame into the child.
That's a natural assumption, yeah.
You know, the whole don't touch that, it's dirty, or cover yourself up, you should feel ashamed, conditioning. We assume society builds the dams.
Freud anticipates that exact assumption, and he pushes back on it vigorously.
Oh, really?
Yeah, while he concedes that education and societal conditioning certainly reinforce these dams, they carve the channels deeper, he argues that this development is fundamentally organically determined.
Wait, organically? Like biologically fixed?
Yes, fixed by heredity.
Really? So even if you raised a child in a complete vacuum, completely devoid of any Victorian moralizing, Freud is saying they would still spontaneously develop shame.
He is. He argues that education doesn't create the dams out of thin air. It merely follows the lines already organically laid down by the evolutionary history of the human race.
That's a huge claim.
It is. He says the capacity for disgust and shame is a biological inheritance, a necessary evolutionary adaptation to allow humans to live in close proximity in civilized groups. The internal dams would emerge regardless.
But the energy behind those infantile impulses, that raw, passionate force we had to encrypt it, doesn't just evaporate because a biological dam was built.
No, it definitely doesn't.
Energy can't be destroyed in a closed system, right? It can only change form. So what happens to the water when the dam blocks the river?
It gets diverted. And this leads us to two of the most critical mechanisms in all of Freudian theory, sublimation and reaction formation.
Okay, let's break this down.
During this latency period, the sexual impulses cannot be utilized for reproduction. That function is biologically deferred until puberty.
Right.
Furthermore, if these early impulses were to break through, they would clash violently with the newly built dams of shame and disgust, causing intense psychological unpleasure.
So what does the mind do?
The mind performs an astonishing trick. Through the process of sublimation, the energy of these infantile sexual impulses is diverted from its original sexual aim and directed toward entirely new, non-sexual, cultural, and social achievements.
So let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the scale of this claim.
It's math.
What this essentially means is that civilization, culture, art, science, and even our personal highest virtues are largely fueled by redirected, sublimated toddler urges.
That's exactly it.
We are literally powering the space program and the Renaissance with repressed primal instincts.
That is the profound and to many deeply disturbing core of Freud's argument regarding civilization. Every great artistic triumph, every obsessive leap in scientific research, every complex social structure is heavily subsidized by diverted sexual energy.
That is just, it completely shifts how you view human achievement.
It really does. The engine of human progress is running on the fuel of repressed infantile desires. But sublimation, which channels energy outward into creation, isn't the only mechanism.
Right, you mentioned reaction formation.
Yes. Freud also details reaction formation, which is a strictly defensive maneuver.
How does that differ from sublimation?
Sublimation is redirecting the energy. Reaction formation is building a wall to fight it. When an infant has a perverse primal impulse that would now cause severe unpleasure due to the dams of shame and disgust, the mind actively builds up an opposing force to keep it in check.
So it fights fire with fire.
Basically, the mind creates a conscious virtue, specifically to counteract the repressed unconscious vice.
Give me an example of what that looks like in a person. Like, how does that manifest?
Take an adult with an exaggerated, almost debilitating sense of pity for others. Freud would argue that this is often a reaction formation against repressed childhood cruelty or sadism.
Oh, wow. So they are so empathetic because they are secretly hiding an urge to be cruel?
Exactly. The conscious mind is terrified of its own unconscious sadistic urges, so it overcompensates by becoming pathologically empathetic.
That's wild. Are there other examples?
Sure. Take an obsessive need for cleanliness.
Oh.
The person who washes their hands 50 times a day, that is a reaction formation against repressed early infantile impulses to play with dirt or excrement.
So our characters, the very virtues we pride ourselves on, are often just the fortified walls holding back our most primal opposite selves.
Exactly.
That is a lot to digest. The idea that my best traits might just be heavy artillery pointed inward at my darkest instincts.
It's definitely a heavy concept to sit with.
But before we get totally lost in the adult mind, we have to go back to the source. We are talking about the defenses, the dams, the sublimation, the reaction formation.
Right. The latency period.
Yeah, but before all of this defense infrastructure is built, how do these primal urges first show themselves? If we could look at the unencrypted files of a newborn, what is the absolute archetype of pleasure?
To find the archetype, Freud points to the most universal of all infant behavior, something so mundane we barely even think about it.
Which is?
Sensual sucking or thumb sucking. He leans heavily on a study by a pediatrician named Lindner to break this down.
Okay, thumb sucking.
Yeah. To understand why thumb sucking is the prototype for all infantile sexual activity, we must trace its evolution from day one. It doesn't start as an isolated pleasure-seeking activity.
It starts as feeding, right?
Exactly. It begins inextricably attached to a vital somatic function, the biological instinct for self-preservation, specifically taking nourishment at the mother's breast.
Right, eating to survive. There is nothing inherently sexual about needing calories.
The need for calories is biological survival, sure. However, the warm flow of milk provides not just nutrition, but the infant's very first experience of intense physical pleasure.
Okay.
The infant takes in the milk, falls back from the breast, satiated, flushed, often with a blissful smile. It's a physiological picture that Freud notes persists as the absolute prototype for sexual satisfaction in later adult life.
But at this earliest stage, the sexual activity is entirely attached to the function of survival.
Yes, it cannot be separated from the taking of food. They are one and the same action.
So the infant is getting biological sustenance and physical pleasure simultaneously. But then, as the child develops, a critical physiological shift happens that breaks that unity.
The teeth arrive.
Right, the teeth.
The arrival of the teeth is the catalyst for the crucial split. When teeth appear, chewing begins. Food is no longer taken in exclusively by sucking.
And this changes everything.
This is the moment the infant psychology fractures in a fascinating way. The biological need for the pleasure of sucking becomes completely detached from the biological need for food. The child remembers the profound, blissful pleasure originally linked to feeding and now actively seeks to recreate it, but entirely independently of nutrition.
I love this concept. It's as if you discovered that a utility app on your phone meant strictly for banking, or business in this case. Nutrition had a hidden, highly addictive game built into the code representing pleasure.
That is a perfect analogy.
Once you realize the game is there, you stop using the app for business entirely and just start playing the game on your own, draining the battery for the sheer fun of it.
The mechanics translate perfectly. The infant isolates the pleasure-yielding mechanism from its original utilitarian purpose.
But because the infant cannot command the mother's breast to appear at will to play this game, they must find a substitute.
Exactly. They turn to what they can control their own body. A thumb, a lip, a big toe. They recreate the blissful satisfaction on their own terms.
And this introduces a concept that is absolutely central to the rest of Freud's theory, right? Autoerotism.
Autoerotism.
Being self-generated.
Precisely in the sense that the infant's instinct at this stage is not directed towards other people. It does not require an external object or another human being.
They just need themselves.
Right. The child obtains satisfaction exclusively from its own body. This progression allows Freud to lay down the three essential defining characteristics of an early infantile sexual manifestation.
Let's hear them.
First, it originally attaches itself to a vital somatic function, like eating to survive. Second, it is autoerotic. It needs no outside object. And third, its sexual aim is dominated by an erotogenic zone.
And that term, erotogenic zone, is the master key that unlocks the geography of our early development.
It really is the map.
If the lips and mouth act as the first gateway to pleasure, Freud essentially maps out a specific, predestined topography of the human body that dictates how we develop.
Yes, we don't just experience pleasure everywhere equally. The body has hotspots.
And obviously, based on the thumb sucking, we have to start with the oral zone.
The oral zone, which encompasses the lips and the mucous membrane of the mouth, retains its immense psychological significance long after childhood.
How so?
Freud asserts that individuals who have a constitutional intensification of this labial region, meaning this zone remains highly charged and sensitive for them due to heredity or intense early stimulation, will carry this fixation straight into adulthood.
Like they keep the habit.
Basically.
Oh.
They might become epicures in kithing or find powerful unconscious motives for drinking and smoking. The pleasure is still localized there.
But what if that zone gets caught behind one of the dams we talked about? What if society or intense parenting forces a severe repression of that oral fixation?
If it is subjected to severe repression, the energy becomes pathological. And here is where Freud's concept of the dual purpose of these zones becomes dangerous.
Because it's still attached to eating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the mouth's original purpose was nutritional, repressed sexual energy in the oral zone will disrupt the biological function it was originally attached to.
Oh, man, so it hijacks the system.
The repressed energy hijacks the digestive tract. This can lead to hysterical vomiting, severe constriction of the throat, and complex eating disorders. The mind is using the biological function of eating to express a repressed psychological conflict.
Wow. So the infant masters the mouth, but as they grow, their nervous system matures, their biology demands new things, and their awareness shifts down the digestive tract.
Right. They face a new biological necessity.
Body training. How does this mundane biological necessity suddenly become a psychological battleground? Because this brings us to a zone that is heavily stigmatized in adult society, but intensely structurally important to the infant, the anal zone.
The anal zone is where Freud's analysis becomes highly rigorous, deeply physiological, and For many readers, incredibly shocking.
It definitely raises some eyebrows.
Just like the mouth, the anal zone is situated perfectly to act as a medium through which early sexuality attaches to another vital somatic function, which is the elimination of waste.
Right.
Freud details how the intestinal canal is physiologically highly susceptible to intense excitations. For instance, intestinal catarrhs or ailments in early infancy provide the zone with intense, unintended stimulation.
So it sensitizes the area.
Exactly. It leaves a permanent, highly sensitized mark on the nervous system.
And Freud describes the specific scatological mechanics of how infants interact with this zone. It isn't just passive biology happening to them, is it? They figure out how to operate the machinery for pleasure.
They do. Infants discover through trial and error that they can deliberately hold back their stool.
They just hold it in.
Yes.
Yes.
This isn't just accidental constipation, it is intentional retention. The accumulation of the fecal mass causes violent muscular contractions in the bowel.
Okay, I see where this is going.
When the mass is finally allowed to pass, it stimulates the highly sensitive mucous membrane of the anal canal with immense friction, producing intense, highly pleasurable, albeit somewhat painful, sensations.
So the infant is actively learning to manipulate their own internal biology to produce intense autoerotic stimulation.
Yes, precisely.
Okay, I have to stop you there because this is where the modern listener, and honestly myself, hits a wall of skepticism.
I completely understand why.
Freud is suggesting that an infant in diapers is intentionally holding back stool, not because they are scared of the toilet, but because they are chasing a physical high, that they are essentially biohacking their own digestive tract for pleasure.
He is stating exactly that, and he roots it entirely in clinical observation.
But it just seems so, gross.
And that's exactly Freud's point. He argues that the adult's disgust blinds them to the child's reality. To the infant, the feces are not something disgusting or dirty. The dams of disgust have not been built yet.
Oh, right. They don't have the shame yet.
Exactly. The feces are treated as an extension of their own body, a piece of themselves. And this introduces a psychological dynamic that is even more profound than the physical pleasure,
which is
the concept of leverage.
The feces as leverage. Explain that to me.
Think about the child's environment. The people looking after the child, the all-powerful parents, suddenly start demanding that the bowels be emptied on a strict schedule, on the pot.
Right, potty training.
The child realizes, for the very first time in their life, that they possess something the powerful adults desperately want. They control a resource.
Oh, wow.
Freud argues that feces represent the infant's very first gift. By producing the stool on command, the infant expresses active compliance, yielding part of their body out of love for the caregiver.
But if they don't produce it?
By intentionally withholding it, they express ultimate defiance and disobedience. The adults can force them to eat, they can force them to sleep, but they cannot force them to defecate.
So the infant is essentially using their own bodily functions as their very first negotiation tool with the outside world?
Yes, it is their first real power play.
It's their first experience of power dynamics, creating a physical prototype for compliance and rebellion.
What that actually means in practice is that the child is negotiating their emerging ego through their erotogenic zones. The battle of the potty is the child's first assertion of free will.
That is fascinating.
And just like the oral zone, the anal zone leaves a permanent psychological blueprint. Freud traces adult pathology directly back to these infantile battles.
How does that show up in adults?
The intentional retention of the fecal mass in infancy is one of the primary roots of chronic constipation in neuropathic adults. The fixation on this zone also explains the scatological practices, rigid rituals, and obsessive ceremonies that neurotics often keep deeply secret.
And what about personality traits? Like if someone sublimates that anal energy instead of repressing it into a neurosis?
Freud famously links 3 distinct character traits to the sublimation of anal erotism. They are obstinacy, rigid orderliness, and thriftiness or parsimony.
Wait, really?
Yes. The child who stubbornly holds back their stool to assert control becomes the adult who stubbornly holds on to their money or obsessively organizes their desk to maintain control over their environment.
So it's the exact same psychological energy.
The psychological energy is identical. It has just been diverted from the physical bowel to the social environment.
Which brings us to the third predestined geography on Freud's map, which is the genital zone. Now, based on the timeline, you would think this zone wouldn't activate until much later, right?
You would think so, but while the genital zone does not play the dominant opening part in infantile life, it is stimulated from a very early age.
How so?
Freud points out that it is subjected to constant, unavoidable physical interaction during routine nursery care. The washing, rubbing, and cleaning of secretions by caregivers ensures that the child inevitably notices the highly pleasurable sensations this specific part of the body can produce.
Oh, so it's accidental stimulation?
Yes, and this accidental stimulation creates a need for its repetition. This early infantile masturbation establishes the foundational neural circuitry for the genital zone's future primacy over all the other erotogenic zones.
So it is laying the groundwork for puberty long before puberty ever arrives.
Exactly. It's pre-wiring the system.
So we have the complete map of the zones here: oral, anal, genital. But as we established, human development isn't a straight line. Having mapped the geography of the body, we must now map the timeline of how these zones are activated.
Right, the timeline is just as important as the zones themselves.
Human development occurs in a series of volatile waves, and Freud identifies 3 distinct phases of infantile masturbation.
This timeline is critical for understanding why human psychological development is so incredibly fragile. Phase 1 occurs in early infancy.
Which is what we were just talking about, right?
Yes, this is the autoerotic stimulation we just discussed. The thumb sucking, the early anal retention, the accidental genital stimulation. It blossoms as the child discovers their body, and then typically it vanishes after a short time, giving way to a brief lull.
But the lull is a fake out, because then comes the explosion.
Phase 2 is a brief, massive efflorescence of sexual activity that occurs right around the 4th year of life.
Age 4.
Yes, this is a total resurgence. The sexual instinct belonging to the genital zone revives and persists fiercely for a time.
What does that look like in a 4-year-old?
Early masturbation returns, either through active physical stimulation or through unconscious processes akin to nocturnal emissions, which are often masked and diagnosed by doctors as simple bedwetting or bladder disorders.
So doctors were completely misdiagnosing it.
Often, yes. What happens during this explosive 4th year of life leaves the deepest, most permanent unconscious impressions in the subject's memory. It is the crucible.
The crucible.
It determines the development of their character if they remain healthy, and it entirely dictates the exact symptomatology of their neurosis if they fall ill after puberty.
And just to close the loop on the timeline, phase 3.
Phase 3 is the final transition into pubertal sexuality, where the mature reproductive aims take over and the latency period ends.
But we really have to focus on phase 2, that 4th year of life, because the child is existing in a very specific, highly vulnerable psychological state.
They are completely wide open.
Freud uses a phrase to describe this state that is incredibly famous, often weaponized, and honestly widely misunderstood. He says the child has a polymorphously perverse disposition.
Yes, that phrase has caused a lot of controversy.
Okay, I have to push back on the terminology here. Calling a 4-year-old perverse seems deliberately inflammatory. What is he actually diagnosing when he uses that phrase?
I get that.
Right.
To understand the term, we have to remember the dams we discussed earlier: shame, disgust, and morality.
Right.
In early childhood, these mental dams have either not yet been constructed at all, or they are only just beginning to form as fragile speed bumps.
So there's no filter.
Because there are no internal barriers, no biological disgust, children have an innate constitutional aptitude for all kinds of sexual irregularities. Their instinct isn't channeled into a single, quote-unquote, normal reproductive aim yet.
It's just scattered everywhere.
It is completely fragmented across all the erotogenic zones we talked about: the mouth, the bowel, the skin. Therefore, Freud argues, if a child is seduced or prematurely exposed to sexual acts by older children or adults, they could easily be led into literally any form of perversion.
Because they don't have the immune system of shame to reject it.
Exactly. They possess a polymorphously perverse disposition because they lack the internal resistance to any form of pleasure. They are a blank slate of potential physical gratification. Freud points out that adult prostitutes exploit this exact same infantile polymorphous disposition in their clients, proving that this fragmented, undammed pursuit of pleasure is a general and fundamental human characteristic that usually just gets buried under societal dams.
So the child isn't maliciously perverse, they are simply unrestrained biology.
Precisely. Unrestrained biology.
And because they are experiencing this massive surge of biological energy in their 4th year, and because they don't have the societal dams to contextualize it, their intellect kicks into absolute overdrive trying to make sense of the world.
Right, they become little investigators.
This initiates what Freud calls the period of the sexual researches of childhood.
If we connect this to the cognitive development of the child, it's a period of intense, almost frantic intellectual awakening, usually peaking between ages 3 and 5.
And this research isn't driven by abstract philosophical curiosity, is it?
Not at all. A toddler doesn't sit around pondering the cosmos. Their research is driven by practical existential threats.
Like what?
The most common trigger for this intellectual overdrive is the arrival, or even just the suspected arrival, of a new baby in the house.
The ultimate threat to their survival resources.
Exactly. The child suddenly fears they will lose their parents' care, attention, and love to this intruder. This threat makes them hyper-vigilant, thoughtful, and ruthlessly clear-sighted.
They need answers.
They must solve what Freud calls the riddle of the Sphinx, which is, where do babies come from? If they can figure out how the baby got here, maybe they can control the situation.
But they're trying to solve a complex biological puzzle with a toolkit that only consists of their own infantile experiences.
Right, which is very limited.
Which leads to them constructing what Freud calls infantile sexual theories.
Yes, and these theories are an absolute masterclass in child logic. Because their investigation is strictly limited by their own biological immaturity, they construct theories based on the only things they understand, their own dominant erotogenic zones.
The oral and anal zones.
Yes. Because they understand the oral and anal zones, eating and defecating their earliest theories, reflect this exact mechanical blueprint. They deduce that babies are acquired by eating some particular food, which is a concept constantly reinforced by fairy tales, and that the baby is subsequently born through the bowel like a discharge of feces.
To a toddler, that is the only logical blueprint for making something.
It makes perfect sense to them.
You intake matter, your body processes it, and you output a product. They're just applying the laws of physics as they know them to reproduction.
Exactly. It is highly logical given their limited data set. But their research often hits a traumatic wall.
What happens?
If their brains are in overdrive trying to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, they must be hyper-observant of their parents. What happens if a toddler in that investigative state accidentally witnesses adult intimacy?
Oh, wow.
Often, adults wrongly assume the child is too young to understand anything and leave the door open.
I imagine the child tries to decode it using that same limited toolkit.
They do, and they inevitably misinterpret it catastrophically. Lacking the context of mature, affectionate sexuality and operating heavily from their own infantile instinct for mastery and early cruelty, the child views the act as a form of ill treatment.
Like a fight.
Yes, subjugation or outright violence. They view it in a sadistic sense. Freud argues that this early misunderstood impression heavily predisposes the child to later sadistic displacements in their own adult sexual life.
So the encrypted file reads, intimacy equals violence.
Exactly.
This research phase also leads to a discovery regarding anatomy, which brings us to arguably the most controversial concepts in Freud's entire lexicon. He says the child eventually notices the anatomical distinction between the sexes.
Yes. For a little boy, it is initially self-evident that everyone in the world has a male genital. When he discovers, perhaps by observing a sister or a playmate, that girls do not, his first reaction is furious denial.
He just refuses to believe it.
But when he can no longer deny the visual evidence, his logic takes a dark turn. He assumes that the girl originally had the same anatomy, but it has been cut off as a punishment.
This is the castration complex.
This is the terrifying birth of the castration complex. The boy suddenly fears that if he disobeys his parents, particularly regarding his autoerotic habits or his intense incestuous desires for his mother, he will suffer the same violent punishment.
So fear takes over.
This sheer terror forces a massive repression of his early impulses.
Well, wait a second. I need to stop the train here. He's saying a toddler discovers they don't have certain anatomy and immediately assumes it was violently surgically removed as a punitive measure.
Yes.
That sounds incredibly extreme, even absurd to a modern ear. Is Freud speaking literally here, or is this castration complex just a dramatic metaphor for a general loss of power or parental withdrawal of love?
Freud is speaking literally. In the text, he grounds this entirely in the child's logic of punishment.
Really? Literally?
You have to view it from the child's perspective. Their entire life is governed by physical threats from giants. Don't touch the stove or you'll burn your hand. Don't run or you'll break your leg. Stop playing with yourself or I'll cut it off.
Which was a real threat parents used back then, right?
Exactly, a threat historically used by nannies and parents in Victorian times. So when the child sees physical evidence of an absence, they apply the logic of punishment. They don't understand genetics or varied biology. They understand rules and violent consequences.
And what about the other side of the coin? What happens when little girls make the same anatomical discovery?
According to Freud, little girls do not deny the difference. They immediately recognize it and are overcome by what he terms penis envy, culminating in a powerful, often lifelong unconscious wish to be boys themselves.
Okay.
They feel they have been shortchanged by nature, which heavily influences their psychological detachment from their mother, whom they blame for this biological deficit.
I mean, we could do a 5-hour deep dive just critiquing the societal biases baked into that single concept.
Without a doubt.
But sticking strictly to the mechanics of the child's timeline, it sounds like what parents casually dismiss as the inquisitive toddler phase is actually an intense period of physical and psychological scientific research.
Yes, very intense.
And the tragedy is they conduct this research in complete isolation. They fail to find the real answers because adults lie to them with fables about storks, and eventually society forces them to repress the entire investigation.
The tragedy of the sexual researches of childhood is precisely that they end in failure and renunciation. Because they cannot discover the fertilizing role of semen or the true nature of the female reproductive anatomy, their investigation collapses.
They just hit a dead end.
This failure leaves a permanent melancholy mark on the psyche. It forces the child to alienate themselves from the adults who deceived them. It is their first bitter step towards psychological independence, born entirely out of frustration and repressed instinct.
And then what?
And the repression of this research phase marks the definitive beginning of the latency period. The dams are built. The vault is locked.
Wow. We have completely dismantled the myth of the asexual childhood. We've mapped the fragmented autoerotic urges of the infant, the shifting focus from the oral to the anal zones, the explosive, desperate researches of the toddler years, and the massive biological and societal dams of shame and disgust built to hide it all.
It is a massive undertaking by the human mind.
Now, the ultimate question. How does Freud pull this chaotic, fragmented web into the unified adult mind?
This requires us to look at the masterclass synthesis Freud achieves when he describes the transformations of puberty.
The grand finale.
This is the grand finale of human development. At puberty, a massive biological and psychological collision occurs. On one side, you have the disparate, repressed, infantile excitations, the oral fixations, the anal retention, the autoerotic impulses that have been hiding in the dark. On the other side, you have the towering neural dams built during the latency period. Shame, disgust, and strict moral ideals.
The unstoppable biological force meets the immovable societal object.
Precisely. For a normal adult sexual life to form, an incredibly complex reorganization must happen under immense pressure.
What happens first?
First, the autoerotic components must finally surrender their independence. They can no longer seek pleasure for their own sake. They must subordinate themselves to the absolute primacy of the genital zone.
So they become secondary.
Their new role is merely to provide for pleasure, to build the necessary tension for the final reproductive act. Second, the object of the instinct must change. It can no longer be the subject's own body. It must be an external person.
But picking that external person is incredibly complex because of the past, right? The child has a decade of encrypted files telling them who to love.
To take that a step further, Freud describes adult object choice as a convergence of two distinct currents that must be perfectly aligned, like a tunnel being drilled through a mountain from both sides.
Okay, two currents.
The first is the affectionate current. This is rooted deep in childhood. It is the damped down, sublimated, tender love the child felt for their parents and caregivers.
And the second?
The second is the sensual current, which arrives with the raw biological surge of puberty.
But the sensual current can't attach to the parents because the incest taboo, the heaviest dam of all, blocks it.
Exactly, because the barrier against incest forbids the sensual current from attaching to the original objects of affection. The adolescent must violently detach from parental authority and find a new external object outside the family.
So they have to look elsewhere.
If the affectionate current and the sensual current successfully converge on this new external object, if the tunnel meets perfectly in the middle, normal adult sexual identity is formed. You have tenderness combined with sensual desire.
And if they don't converge, if the tunnel doesn't meet in the middle because one of the dams is too thick or one of the infantile fixations is too strong,
then the entire apparatus fails. If the dams of disgust and shame are too strong, they block the sensual current entirely. Or, if a childhood fixation on the oral or anal zone is too powerful, the normal path to genital primacy is blocked.
So what happens to the energy?
And here's Freud's grand unifying equation. The libido behaves exactly like a stream of water. If the main channel is blocked by repression, the water flows backward.
Oh, wow.
It fills up the old collateral channels of childhood that we mapped earlier. It floods back into the oral zone, the anal zone, the sadistic impulses.
It goes back to the unencrypted files.
Yes.
Yes.
And if the person acts on these revived infantile impulses directly, overriding their shame, they develop a perversion.
Okay.
But if their moral dams are too strong to allow the perversion to happen, the blocked energy must force its way out into disguise. It emerges as a neurotic symptom.
Like the ones we talked about.
Exactly. Hysterical vomiting, obsessive-compulsive rituals, crippling phobias. These are just the disguised, agonizing expressions of repressed infantile sexuality fighting against the dams of civilization. This is why Freud famously declares, neuroses are the negative of perversions.
That is just, it's an incredible framework. But it leaves me with this final thought for you, the listener. If Freud is right that our neuroses, our anxieties, our phobias, our compulsions are born directly from the collision between our primal infantile instincts and the specific dams of shame and disgust built by society, what happens to the human psyche when a society radically changes its definitions of shame and disgust?
That is the big question.
We live in an era where the Victorian dams have largely been blown up. Does the very nature of human neurosis mutate as our culture evolves? Are we creating entirely new psychological diseases because we changed the architecture of the dams?
That is the existential question that psychoanalysts and sociologists are still wrestling with today. If the architecture of the dams changes, the flow of the repressed energy must inevitably find new, perhaps entirely unprecedented channels of expression.
Because the energy has to go somewhere.
The biology of the infant hasn't changed, but the walls we build to contain it are shifting beneath our feet.
We started this deep dive looking for a clean X-ray, a simple binary diagnosis of the human condition. Instead, Freud has shown us that the adult mind is a precarious city built over the buried, volatile ruins of our own childhood. A prehistoric epoch we are forced to encrypt just to survive in civilized society. The muddy waters we're trying to navigate are, in fact, our own forgotten depths.
It's a journey into the darks for sure.
Thank you for exploring the deep cosmos of the human mind with us. You've been on a documentary journey through one of the most profound, challenging texts in psychological history. We'll see you next time on Fact Horizon.